They called her Unmateable in front of 300 witnesses, and Briar Ashdown had already decided to run before the echo of the word finished bouncing off the rafters. Unmateable. Her uncle said it like a verdict, standing at the head of the auction dais with his hands clasped behind his back, his voice pitched to carry to the very last row of the Ashdown longhouse. Defective scent glands, no bond response, a poor investment for any alpha seeking an heir. He did not look at her while he said it. He never looked at her when he lied. Briar stood on the raised platform in the white presentation dress the pack elders had laced her into that morning. The fabric cinched so tight she could feel her own heartbeat in her ribs, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the worst moments of a life, that she was watching her own execution, dressed up as a business transaction. Debt-bonded Omegas were not rejected for defects. They were rejected when the price offered didn't clear the family ledger, and rejection meant the workhouses, or worse, the unregistered breeding houses 2 territories over, that no pack elder would name aloud, but every Omega knew by reputation. She had grown up believing her uncle merely disliked her. It had taken her 22 years to understand that dislike was not the same as danger, and that the difference had been standing in her house the entire time, wearing her dead mother's signet ring on his smallest finger. The buyers murmured. Somewhere in the crowd, a merchant alpha laughed, low and ugly, and said something about damaged goods being sold at a discount, and Briar's vision narrowed to a single bright point of decision. The side door behind the dais, propped open for the summer heat, guarded by exactly 1 bored sentry who had spent the last hour flirting with a serving girl instead of watching the Omega he was supposed to be guarding. She did not remember deciding to move. She remembered the dress tearing at the seam as she vaulted the low rail, remembered the shocked intake of breath from 300 throats at once, remembered her uncle's voice cracking for the first time that day as he shouted her name like a curse. She ran through the kitchens, past cooks who flattened themselves against the walls, rather than touch a pack alpha's business, out into the loading yard, where the visiting dignitaries' carriages sat in a neat row, waiting for an auction that had just become considerably more interesting. The nearest carriage had its door slightly ajar. Black lacquer, no crest that she recognized in the dark, a set of matched gray wolves in harness stamping impatiently at the flies. She did not have the luxury of choosing carefully. She threw herself inside, dropped to the floor between the bench seats, and dragged a heavy fur lap blanket over herself, just as the door swung fully open and the carriage rocked under someone's weight climbing in. Briar stopped breathing. The someone settled onto the bench above her, with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry, and rapped twice on the carriage roof. The wolves lurched into motion. Through a gap in the blanket, she watched a pair of boots. Good leather, well worn. The boots of a man who walked more than he rode, cross and recross at the ankle. "You may as well breathe," the voice above her said, mild as a man commenting on weather. "I can hear your heart from here, and frankly it's distracting." She went rigid. The voice did not belong to any alpha she'd ever heard address the Ashdown pack. It carried the flat, unplaceable authority of a man who had never had to raise it to be obeyed. And beneath that authority, underneath the words themselves, something in her chest gave a single hard, unfamiliar pull, like a hook sinking into flesh she hadn't known was there. The blanket lifted away from her face. Above her, filling the carriage with a presence too large for the space he occupied, sat a man with dark hair silvering faintly at the temples, and eyes the color of a winter sky before snow, pale, still, and far too observant. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding at the torn seam of her dress, where a thin line of blood had welled up along a scrape. "And you're an Ashdown Omega, unless the crest on that auction dais lied to me." His gaze moved over her face with an attention that felt like being catalogued. "Which means you have approximately 4 minutes before your uncle's guards search every carriage in that yard, and you have chosen, of every vehicle available to you, to hide in mine." "I didn't know it was..." Briar's voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again, forcing steel into it even as her hands shook against the carriage floor. I didn't know whose it was. I'm sorry. Let me out at the gate. I'll disappear. No one needs to know. No one needs to know, he repeated, and something moved behind his pale eyes that might have been amusement, if amusement could look that dangerous. Little Omega, do you have any idea whose carriage you're kneeling in? She shook her head, throat too tight for words. Kale Draven, he said. Alpha King of Thornevale, currently making an extremely tedious diplomatic visit to your uncle's pact to discuss trade tariffs on iron ore, and, as of approximately 6 minutes ago, a witness to your uncle publicly declaring his own niece defective merchandise in front of the very buyers I was sent to negotiate with. He tilted his head, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he hadn't expected to find in his own carriage. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say? A man about to lose his best trade partner suddenly needs to explain why the daughter of the previous alpha bloodline was for sale at all. The words landed like ice water. Briar's mind, running purely on animal terror until that moment, snagged hard on the phrase previous alpha bloodline. My mother wasn't alpha bloodline, she said slowly. My uncle inherited clean. There was never a challenge, wasn't there? King Draven's pale eyes didn't blink. Tell me, Miss Ashdown, did your mother die of fever, as I understand the official record states? Or did she die 3 months after your father, in a pack with no living alpha heir but her own daughter, conveniently before that daughter came of age to challenge for the title herself? Briar's whole body had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with fear of capture, and everything to do with a door in her chest she had never once let herself open. She had been 11 when her mother died. She had been told it was fever. She had never once, in 11 years since, allowed herself to wonder why the fever had taken her mother in 4 days and left no one else in the household so much as sneezing. You're lying, she whispered, without conviction. I have absolutely no reason to lie to you, King Draven said. I've known you for 6 minutes, and I already suspect you're about to become the single greatest complication of my year. He reached over and rapped the carriage roof again. A different pattern this time, and the wolves picked up speed, hooves drumming faster against the packed dirt road. Which is why, he continued, settling back against the bench as if he had all the time in the world, you are no longer getting out at the gate. Behind them, faint over the sound of their own wheels, a horn sounded from the direction of the Ashdown longhouse. 3 short blasts, the old pack signal for runaway, pursue. Briar's uncle had just discovered exactly which carriage was missing from the yard. The wolves ran through the night at a pace no ordinary carriage team should have sustained, and somewhere around the 2nd hour, Briar stopped bothering to pretend she wasn't watching the king as closely as he was watching her. He had produced, from some compartment beneath the bench, a plain wool cloak that he'd tossed into her lap without comment, and a flask of something warm and bitter that turned out to be medicinal rather than social, meant, she realized after the first swallow, for the scrape on her arm rather than her nerves. You're not what I expected an alpha king to be, she admitted, somewhere past exhaustion, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel less dangerous than honest. And you're not what I expected a debt-bonded Omega to be, he said. Debt-bonded Omegas do not, in my experience, vault auction rails in front of 300 witnesses. They wait to be rescued. You did not strike me as a woman waiting for anything. There was no one coming to rescue me, Briar said. There never has been. Something shifted in his expression at that. Not pity, which she would have hated, but a kind of recalculation, as though she had just handed him a piece of information he intended to keep. Your uncle called you unmateable, he said instead. For the record, Miss Ashdown, I would like to note that in the 6 hours since meeting you, I have detected no scent gland defect whatsoever. Quite the opposite, in fact, which is a professional observation and not a personal one. A pause, precisely timed. Mostly, Briar felt heat climb her throat that had nothing to do with the flask. Then why would he say it? Because a working scent bond in an Ashdown line Omega is not a defect, King Draven said. And for the first time, something hard entered his voice, iron under silk. It's a claim. And your uncle has spent 11 years making very sure no one ever tested whether you had one, including, I would wager, you. The carriage hit a rut hard enough to throw her against his knee, and in the half-second before she caught herself, close enough to breathe him in properly for the first time, that hook in her chest pulled again. Sharper, unmistakable, alive. Briar became aware, in the silence that followed, of details she'd been too terrified to notice before. The carriage's interior smelled of cedar and gun oil, and something warmer underneath. Like wood smoke on cold air. The wolves in harness were not ordinary wolves at all, but shifted war mounts, bred for endurance rather than speed, the kind only a royal house could afford to keep. And the man across from her, for all his idle drawl, held himself with the coiled stillness of someone who had spent far more of his life fighting than negotiating tariffs. "You're doing the thing," King Draven observed. "What thing?" "Cataloging me. Deciding whether I'm a threat by inventory, rather than instinct." A ghost of something that might have been approval crossed his face. "It's not a bad strategy, for someone who's had to survive on it her whole life. Most alphas would find it insulting to be assessed like a horse at market. I find it sensible. Keep doing it. You don't know anything about how I've had to survive. I know your uncle called you defective in front of 300 people to avoid explaining why the last living challenger to his title was standing on an auction block," King Draven said, without heat. "I know you vaulted a rail rather than wait to see what price you'd fetch. I know you apologized to me twice in the first 10 minutes for the crime of trying to stay alive. That's not nothing, Miss Ashdown. That's a great deal, actually, and none of it particularly comforting." Briar pulled the borrowed cloak tighter, unsettled by how precisely he'd read her, and unsettled further by how little she minded it. Why does an Alpha King travel with only one guard captain and a handful of soldiers to a pack half the size of his own territory? Because a king who arrives with an army to discuss iron tariffs is a king who expects to need one, he said. "I find it useful to let smaller packs believe I trust them. It tends to reveal, rather quickly, which of them deserve it." His gaze flicked toward the small carriage window, toward the dark tree line rushing past. "Your uncle, for what it's worth, failed that particular test 11 months ago. I've simply been waiting for proof solid enough to act on." She thought, unbidden, of the last time she'd seen her mother's handwriting. A single recipe card, tucked into a cookbook her uncle had never thought to burn. The ink faded, but the hand unmistakably steady, unmistakably warm. Inez Ashdown had run this pack for 9 years before the fever took her, and in every story Briar had ever managed to coax out of the older pack members, carefully, sideways, never asking directly for fear of drawing her uncle's attention. Her mother had been remembered as fierce in counsel and soft with her own daughter, in a way that felt now like a door Briar had spent 11 years standing outside of without knowing it was there at all. The Ashdown longhouse under her mother's rule had traded fairly with 3 neighboring packs, and never once, as far as any story told it, sold a debt-bonded Omega to cover a shortfall. Briar was beginning to understand with a grief that had nowhere yet to land. An entirely different pack than the one she'd grown up believing was simply how things were. "You knew her," she said suddenly. "My mother. You said the previous Alpha bloodline like you'd looked into it before tonight, not like you were guessing in the moment." "I looked into every pack bordering Thornevale the year I took the crown," King Draven said. "Your mother's name came up more than once, and always with the same word attached to it. Fair. It is not a word anyone has used about your uncle's rule in all the years since, in any report that's crossed my desk. I noticed the absence before I ever noticed you, if I'm being precise about it. You are, in that sense, the second mystery your family has handed me. I simply didn't expect the first one to climb into my carriage and solve herself." The horn sounded behind them a third time, closer now, and Briar's hands twisted in the wool of the cloak. "If they catch us—" "They will not catch us," King Draven said, in a tone that closed the subject entirely. "Because I do not lose things I have decided to keep, Miss Ashdown. And as of approximately 11 minutes ago, I have decided to keep asking questions about you until I have answers I actually believe." The pursuit horn sounded a third time, and then, abruptly, stopped. Briar braced for the crash of hooves alongside the carriage, for her uncle's guards flanking the doors. But instead, the wolves simply slowed, then halted, and King Draven swung down from the carriage without hurry, sword still sheathed, to speak with someone Briar couldn't see. She caught fragments through the door he'd left ajar. A voice she recognized as her uncle's second-in-command, stiff with the particular deference owed to a foreign king, apologizing for the disturbance, asking, carefully, so carefully, whether His Majesty had perhaps seen a runaway Omega on the road. "I've seen no one of the sort," King Draven said, in a tone so bored it could have frozen a hearth fire. "Though I confess, I find it remarkable that Alpha Ashdown considers a single Omega worth mounting a night pursuit for, given how loudly he insisted an hour ago that she was worth nothing at all." A pause, thick with unspoken threat. "Do give him my regards, and inform him that the iron ore tariffs we discussed are, as of this evening, considerably less favorable than they were this morning. Poor negotiating conditions tonight." My mind kept wandering. The second-in-command did not argue with an Alpha King. The carriage rolled on. When King Draven climbed back in, Briar had not moved from the corner where she'd wedged herself, knees drawn up, the borrowed cloak clutched tight. "You lied for me," she said, "to my uncle's own man. Why?" "I don't lie," he said, settling back onto the bench. "I simply declined to volunteer information he had not specifically requested with sufficient precision. There's a difference, and it's one I intend to keep exploiting for as long as it serves me." He studied her again, that same cataloging attention. "As for why, Miss Ashdown, I did not become Alpha King of Thornevale by ignoring a debt-bonded Omega who bleeds a particular scent when she's frightened, and whose uncle has spent a very great deal of energy making sure no one gets close enough to notice it." Briar's pulse stuttered. "What scent?" "The scent of unclaimed royal blood," he said simply. "Ashdown blood, specifically, though not the branch currently sitting on the Pack Council. Your mother's branch, the one that should have inherited." She wanted to argue. She had spent 11 years building a version of her life sturdy enough to stand on. Orphaned niece, tolerated dependent, eventually a debt to be discharged at auction. And every plank of it was creaking under the weight of what he was suggesting. "If that were true," she said, "someone would have told me. Someone would have needed to survive telling you," King Draven said, quiet now. "Your uncle did not seize the Ashdown title through succession, Miss Ashdown. He seized it through a technicality, an unchallenged claim, filed the week your mother died, when the only person with a stronger blood right to challenge him was a grieving 11-year-old with no pack elders willing to champion her case. That is not inheritance. That is theft with excellent paperwork." The carriage rattled on through the dark for a long moment, before Briar trusted her voice again. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want from it?" "An excellent question, and one I intend to be honest about, because I think you've had quite enough people lying to you for one lifetime." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, the king's authority dropping away for just a moment into something more direct, more human. "Thornvale's northern border runs along Ashdown territory. For 3 years, your uncle has been quietly redirecting pack tribute, grain, ore, and I now strongly suspect debt-bonded Omegas, to buyers who are not on any approved trade registry. I've had my own people investigating the shortfall for a year without proof solid enough to act on. Tonight, without meaning to, You handed me the proof. A pack alpha selling his last living rival at public auction, rather than let her come of age and challenge him, is not a man confident in his legitimacy. He's a man erasing evidence. So I'm useful to you, Briar said, and hated how small her voice came out. You are considerably more than useful to me, King Draven said, and something in his tone made the hook in her chest pull taut again, which is precisely the complication I mentioned earlier. But yes, you are also useful. Both things are permitted to be true at once. They rode in silence after that, the kind that asks questions neither party is ready to answer aloud. Briar watched him from the corner of her eye. The economy of his movements, the way he checked the road behind them without seeming to check anything at all. The faint white scar along his jaw that spoke of a fight he'd survived rather than won cleanly. He was not, she was slowly understanding, a man performing kindness for an audience. There was no audience. He simply was who he was whether or not anyone was watching, and that, more than the crown or the title, was what frightened her most. There's a rest house 2 hours ahead, he said eventually, breaking the silence. Run by a widow loyal to Thornevale, rather than to any pack registry. You'll be safe there while I send word to my beta. He hesitated, the first hesitation she'd seen from him. I should tell you plainly, Miss Ashdown, since you deserve plain things after tonight. The scent bond response I mentioned is not one-directional. I felt it the moment you hit my knee in that carriage rut. I've felt it 3 times since. I am telling you this not to press any claim on you. You owe me nothing, and I intend to keep it that way. But because I think you've spent your whole life being managed by people who withheld information for their own advantage, and I refuse to be one more. Briar's face went hot, then cold, then hot again. You're saying that there's a... I'm saying, King Draven said, with the particular care of a man choosing each word like a stone to stand on, that fate bonds are rare enough that I have met exactly 0 of my own in 34 years of living, that I did not travel to your uncle's pack looking for one, and that I would very much like you to have the freedom to decide what, if anything, that means to you. Once you're no longer running for your life, and can think clearly enough to decide anything at all. It was, Briar thought, the first time in her adult life that anyone had offered her a choice about her own future, without a price already attached. There is one more thing you should know before we go further, King Draven added, and something in his voice made her go still again. I did not travel to your uncle's pack alone. Lady Ottilie Marchetti, of the Marchetti Trade House, has accompanied my delegation as a proposed political match, a union my council has been urging for 2 years, to secure grain routes through her family's territory. She is, for what it's worth, a formidable and entirely reasonable woman, and I would not want you to hear her name from anyone else, and assume there is some deception here to match your uncle's. Briar's stomach dropped in a way she didn't examine too closely. You're betrothed. I am proposed, he corrected. There is a considerable difference, one my council does not always appreciate. Lady Ottilie herself appreciates it a great deal. She has told me, on 3 separate occasions, that she finds the prospect of ruling beside me exactly as appealing as I find the prospect of ruling beside her, which is to say, professionally tolerable and privately exhausting. A dry note entered his voice. She would, I suspect, be the first to congratulate either of us on finding a reason to let her council pursue trade concessions without the marriage attached. She is not a woman who mistakes politics for romance, and I respect her considerably for it. That's not really an answer to whether you're free to... I am telling you the whole truth, Miss Ashdown, in the order it actually matters, he said, gently, but without apology. You have spent tonight learning that the people meant to protect you built a decade of lies around you instead. I am not going to compound that by leaving out a betrothal negotiation, because it's inconvenient to explain in a moving carriage. Lady Ottilie and I have an understanding, and the understanding is this. Neither of us intends to marry for a fate bond, neither of us has, when better uses of the alliance exist. She would tell you the same. Plainly, if you asked her yourself. I'd wager she'd rather like you, in fact. She has very little patience for men who mistake cruelty for authority. And I suspect your uncle would try both her patience and her temper within the hour. Briar didn't know what to do with the small, unreasonable relief that loosened her chest at that, and chose for the moment not to examine it further. The rest house appeared out of the dark, exactly on schedule. Low, timbered, smoke curling from its chimney. And the widow who met them at the door took one look at Briar's torn dress and King Draven's grim face and asked no questions at all, which told Briar more about the king's reputation among ordinary people than any formal introduction could have. It was past midnight, in a narrow room under the eaves with a single candle guttering low, that Briar finally allowed herself to cry. Not from fear this time, but from the strange, disorienting grief of grieving a mother. She was only now, 11 years late, beginning to understand she'd lost twice. She did not hear the door. She only knew King Draven had entered when his shadow fell across the small window, and when she looked up, red-eyed and furious at her own tears, he did not offer comfort or retreat. He simply sat, at a careful distance, on the room's single wooden chair, and said, "Your mother's personal seal. Did your uncle ever produce it, after she died?" Briar wiped her face, startled by the question's precision. "No. He said it was lost in the fever, burned with her things for contagion. Pack law requires a formal burning to be witnessed by at least 2 elders and recorded in the pack ledger," King Draven said. "Was it?" She thought back. 11 years, to a household in chaos, an uncle already installed in the Alpha's chair before the morning candles had burned down. "I don't know. I was a child. No one told me anything." "Then that," King Draven said, rising, "is precisely what we're going to find out. Because if that seal still exists somewhere in your uncle's longhouse, Miss Ashdown, it is not merely evidence of a smuggling operation." His pale eyes held hers, steady, certain. "It is a formal claim to the Ashdown Alpha title, and it has your mother's blood on the wax, which means it has yours too." The plan, once King Draven's beta arrived 2 days later, was simpler than Briar had expected, and considerably more dangerous than she would have liked. Talia Reyes was a broad-shouldered woman with quick eyes and quicker hands, the kind of beta who had clearly earned her position by being indispensable rather than decorative. And she arrived at the rest house with a satchel of documents and a look of barely contained fury that Briar quickly learned was standard operating temperament rather than anything personal. 3 years, Talia said, spreading ledger pages across the widow's kitchen table. "And every shipment manifest out of Ashdown territory has been perfectly, suspiciously clean. No Omega transports, no irregular ore counts. Which is exactly the problem. Nobody's books are that clean unless someone's paying very good scribes to make them that way." She tapped a column of figures. "Your uncle isn't smuggling through the front gate, Miss Ashdown. He's smuggling through the marriage registry. Debt-bonded Omegas get married off to buyers who don't exist, on paper. In territories that don't exist either. No transport manifest required, because as far as the law's concerned, nothing's being transported. Just a bride going to her husband." Briar felt sick. "How many?" Talia's jaw tightened. "Our count says 11, over 3 years. That we can prove." 11, Briar repeated, and thought of every girl she'd grown up beside, every quiet disappearance she'd been told not to ask about, every time she'd swallowed her own questions because questioning her uncle had never once ended well for anyone who tried. Guilt sat in her chest like a stone. She had survived by staying small and unremarkable, and 11 others hadn't had that option, or hadn't taken it in time. "This isn't your failure to carry," King Draven said, watching her face with that same unnerving precision. "You were a child when it started, and a prisoner in every way that matters for most of the years since. The failure belongs entirely to the man who built the system, and to every elder who looked away rather than challenge him. Which brings us, Talia said, mercifully brisk, to the seal. If it survived, and pack custom being what it is, half of me thinks a man arrogant enough to steal a title outright probably kept the evidence as a trophy rather than destroy it properly. It's most likely in the Alpha's private study, in the strongbox behind the old Accord tapestry. That's where every Ashdown Alpha before him kept ceremonial seals. Creatures of habit. All of them. Briar turned the idea over slowly, feeling its edges for the first time. Not merely a fact to be verified, but a memory trying to surface. I think I've seen that tapestry moved before, she said. Once. I was young, 6, maybe 7. And I wasn't meant to be in that study at all. My uncle had already inherited by then, though I didn't understand what that meant yet. He was standing in front of it, and when he heard me in the doorway, he practically threw the tapestry back into place. I remember being scolded for wandering, not for what I might have seen. I never thought about it again until this moment. 6 or 7, Talia repeated, doing the arithmetic instantly. That's within a year of your mother's death. He wasn't checking on an old family heirloom, Miss Ashdown. He was making sure the evidence of his own theft was still exactly where he'd hidden it. She exhaled, something like grim satisfaction crossing her face. Which means it's likely never left that study at all. Men like your uncle don't destroy the proof of what they've stolen. They keep it close, because some part of them needs to look at it and be reminded they got away with it. The observation settled over Briar with an unpleasant clarity, that for 11 years, while she'd been told she was worthless, her mother's seal had likely been sitting no more than 50 paces from wherever Briar herself had slept, hidden behind a tapestry her uncle dusted and rehung with his own hands. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of cruelty that didn't announce itself as cruelty at all. It simply waited, patient and silent, for someone to finally come looking. Lady Ottilie Marchetti arrived at the rest house the following afternoon, unannounced, in a plain traveling cloak that did nothing to disguise the fact that every stitch of it had been cut by a master tailor. She was tall, sharp-eyed, perhaps 10 years Briar's senior, and she took one look at Briar standing awkwardly by the widow's hearth before turning to King Draven with an expression of profound, weary amusement. "So this is the fate bond," Ottilie said. "Kale, you could not simply tell me over correspondence. I had to hear it from my own trade attaché, who heard it from a very excited stable boy, who apparently heard it from your beta. I was going to tell you the moment it was safe to," King Draven said, with the specific patience of a man who had clearly had this exact argument before. "You arrived faster than the moment. I always do." Ottilie turned her attention fully to Briar, and whatever assessment she made seemed to satisfy her, because her posture eased by a fraction. "Miss Ashdown, I understand you vaulted an auction rail in front of 300 witnesses and stowed away in a king's carriage rather than wait to be sold. I find that considerably more impressive than anything my own family has managed in 3 generations of extremely cautious trade negotiations." She extended a hand, warrior calloused despite the fine clothes. "I am not your rival, whatever anyone has told you. I am a woman who would like grain routes secured through Thornevale before winter, and who has absolutely no interest in competing with an actual fate bond for a marriage I only ever wanted for the tariffs." Briar shook her hand, startled by the directness of it. "I didn't think that a proposed political bride might simply be relieved to be freed of the obligation?" Ottilie's mouth curved, dry. "Miss Ashdown, I have watched 3 cousins marry for love and 2 marry for land, and I promise you the ones who married for land were considerably happier by their 10th anniversary. But land is not the same as a fate bond, and I am not fool enough to compete with biology when there are perfectly good tariffs to be negotiated instead." She glanced at King Draven. I'll want the Northern Grain Corridor written into whatever alliance emerges from this, regardless of who ends up married to whom. Consider that my price for graciously stepping aside." "Done," King Draven said, without hesitation, and something in the easy shorthand between them told Briar more about the nature of their arrangement than any explanation could have. Ottilie stayed only an hour, but in that hour she asked Briar more, pointed, practical questions about pack succession law than anyone else had bothered to in 11 years. What Briar knew of Ashdown's tribute obligations, whether she understood the difference between a challenge and a formal contest, whether she had any notion yet of what kind of alpha she intended to become if the challenge succeeded. When Briar admitted she hadn't thought that far ahead, Ottilie only nodded, unsurprised. "No one thinks that far ahead when they're busy surviving," she said. "But you'll want an answer ready before you stand in that Tribunal Hall, or the elders will supply one for you. And it will not be the answer you'd have chosen." She rose to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Miss Ashdown, I've traded with your uncle's pack for 6 years. I always found his ledgers too clean to trust, and never had proof enough to say so aloud. I'm glad someone finally does." "You want to walk back into that longhouse," Briar said, flat with disbelief. "I want you to walk back into that longhouse," Talia corrected. "During the Harvest Tribunal in 4 days' time, when every pack elder who matters will already be gathered in one hall to formally record Ashdown's tribute count for the year. If you present a valid competing claim, sealed, witnessed, blood verified, in front of that entire assembly, your uncle cannot quietly disappear the problem the way he's disappeared every problem for 11 years. He'll either have to answer the challenge in front of witnesses who can't be threatened into silence, or forfeit the title on the spot for refusing a lawful claim. And if I'm wrong about the seal being there, or if I'm caught, then you're a debt-bonded Omega who ran from an auction and got caught trying to steal from her Alpha," King Draven said quietly. "Which is why you will not be doing this alone, and why we will not be doing this without a great deal more preparation than walk in and hope." The 4 days that followed were the strangest of Briar's life. Equal parts terror and something dangerously close to belonging. Talia drilled her on pack law until she could recite the succession statutes in her sleep. An elderly forger loyal to Thornevale, introduced only as Old Marchetti, with a wink Briar didn't understand until later, taught her to recognize genuine wax seal blood verification from a counterfeit at a glance. And in the evenings, when the lessons ended and the widow's fire burned low, King Draven taught her something else entirely, how it felt to be listened to. He asked about her mother, not the political questions, the legal ones, but what she'd smelled like, what songs she'd hummed, whether she'd been kind. He told her in turn about his own mother, dead a decade now, and about the weight of a crown he'd inherited at 22, with a border war already in progress, and no time to grieve properly before he'd had to lead. He did not touch her, though she caught him watching the pulse at her throat more than once with an expression that cost him visible effort to control. It was, Briar realized somewhere around the 3rd night, the least demanding attention anyone had ever paid her, and the most dangerous, because it made her want things she had spent 11 years training herself not to want. Talia's lessons, by contrast, left no room for softness at all. "Succession law doesn't care how you feel about your uncle," she said, on the 2nd morning, sliding a stack of pack statutes across the table with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had clearly taught this exact material before. "It cares whether you can recite the 7 conditions for a valid blood challenge without hesitating. Because the moment you hesitate in that hall, every elder watching will read it as doubt. And doubt is the one thing that will let your uncle wriggle free of this." She rapped the table. Again. Condition 1. Direct blood descent from a prior title holder, verifiable by seal or witness testimony. Briar recited, for what felt like the 40th time. Condition 2. Absence of a formal, witnessed renunciation of claim. Condition 3. By the 4th day, Briar could recite all 7 in her sleep, could identify a counterfeit blood seal by the particular dullness of its wax under candlelight, and had learned, from old Marchetti's dry-running commentary, more about the mechanics of pack forgery than she suspected any legitimate alpha ought to know. She asked him once, half joking, how a man came to know so much about counterfeiting seals meant to be uncounterfeitable. "Because I spent 30 years forging them for smugglers before Lady Ottilie's grandmother caught me and decided I was more useful loyal than in a cell," he said, entirely unbothered, and did not elaborate further. And Briar decided that some mysteries were better left exactly where they were. 2 days before the tribunal, the plan nearly collapsed entirely. Old Marchetti's contact inside the Ashdown longhouse, a young steward named Rook, who had agreed to confirm the strongbox's location in exchange for passage out of the pack once the dust settled, went silent. No message on the appointed morning, none the following evening, and by the second night, Talia's face had taken on the particular grimness of a woman recalculating every assumption in her plan at once. "Either he's been caught," Talia said, pacing the widow's small kitchen, "or he's sold us out for a better price. Both possibilities require us to assume the strongbox location is compromised, which means walking into that tribunal with a seal we can't confirm, and a plan your uncle may already know is coming. Or he's simply frightened," King Draven said, though his own jaw had tightened. "Rook is 19, and has never done anything more dangerous than skim tribute ledgers for pocket coin. A silence is not automatically a betrayal." It was Briar, in the end, who found the answer, not through strategy, but through memory. "There's a second steward," she said slowly, the detail surfacing from some long-buried corner of her childhood. "Rook's aunt. She served my mother before. She'd know if something happened to him, and she's never had any love for my uncle. She was there the day the elders recorded the fever death, and I remember her arguing with someone about the ledger entry. I was too young to understand it then. I don't think I was too young to remember it." It took a writer 2 days to confirm what Briar's half-formed memory had suggested. Rook had not betrayed them. He had been reassigned, without explanation, to the pack's eastern grain stores 3 days prior. Her uncle's ordinary paranoia rather than specific suspicion, Talia judged, after cross-referencing the timing against nothing more sinister than a routine steward rotation. But the scare had cost them 2 days of preparation, and it left Briar with a colder understanding of exactly how thin the margin for error truly was. "We don't get a second attempt at this," she said that night, watching Talia burn the last of their contingency notes rather than risk them being found. "If the seal isn't where we think it is, or if he's moved it in the confusion, then we adapt," King Draven said. "That is what preparation is for, Briar. Not to guarantee nothing goes wrong. To ensure that when something does, you are not standing there with nothing left to do but panic." He held her gaze, steady in the low firelight. "You have already survived 11 years of a plan you had no say in shaping. You are allowed to trust one you helped build yourself. And there's something you should know before the tribunal," he told her, the night before they were due to leave, both of them sitting on the rest house's back step, under a sky gone thick with stars. Talia's investigation turned up one more name in the marriage registry. Recent, filed 8 days ago. Something in his voice made her go still. "Whose?" "Yours," King Draven said. "Your uncle filed a marriage contract for you 8 days before the auction, to a buyer registered under a false territory, same pattern as the 11 others. The auction wasn't a sale, Miss Ashdown. It was theater, meant to be witnessed and forgotten. You were never meant to leave that hall as an unmarried woman at all. Whoever bid on you tonight would have been buying a wife already legally bound on paper, with no path to challenge it afterward." His jaw tightened, the calm cracking just slightly. He wasn't erasing a rival heir by selling you off cheap. He was erasing you entirely, in a way that would look, to any outside eye, like nothing more than an unremarkable marriage. Briar's hands had gone cold in her lap. "Then he knows. He's always known what I am. He's known since the day your mother died, King Draven said. Everything since, the years of being told you were nothing, the auction, the pretense of a defect, all of it was never about what you lacked, Briar. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it landed with more weight than any title he could have offered instead. It was about what you are. He built an entire life around convincing you to be small enough that you'd never notice how much he had to lose the moment you grew up. The Tribunal Hall, when they reached it 4 days later, was exactly as crowded and exactly as dangerous as Talia had promised. Pack elders in their formal furs, foreign trade delegates murmuring in corners. And at the head of it all, her uncle, resplendent in the Alpha's ceremonial chain, reading the year's tribute count to a room that had no idea it was about to watch the foundations of his rule crack open in real time. Briar walked in through the side entrance precisely when Talia had calculated the tribunal would reach the ceremonial pause between tribute reading and formal closing. The one moment pack law required the floor to be open to any Ashdown-blooded challenger. She carried her mother's seal, recovered exactly where Talia had predicted, wrapped in a plain cloth against her chest like something that might still, after 11 years, be stolen from her one more time. Her uncle saw her before anyone else did. His face went the color of old ash. "I claim challenge," Briar said, and her voice, to her own considerable surprise, did not shake at all. Under the succession law of the Ashdown pack, as the last living daughter of Alpha Inez Ashdown, whose seal I now present to this assembly for blood verification. The hall erupted. Her uncle rose from his chair so fast it clattered backward, already shouting something about theft and forgery and a runaway Omega's delusions. And it was in that exact moment, with 300 witnesses once again watching her, that Briar felt the true shape of the reversal settle into place. The last time this many eyes had been on her in this hall, she had been merchandise. This time, she was the storm. "Test it, then," she said, holding the seal aloft. "In front of everyone. If I'm lying, you have nothing to fear." Her uncle did not move to test it. He moved instead toward the door, and found it blocked by a wall of Thornevale guards who had entered, silent and unhurried, the moment the challenge was formally spoken. "Going somewhere, Alpha Ashdown?" King Draven's voice cut through the chaos, cold as the winter sky in his eyes. "I do hope not. I would so hate for our trade negotiations to end on such an unfinished note." Chaos took the Tribunal Hall the way fire takes dry timber, fast, total, and impossible to argue with once it caught. "This is an internal pack matter," her uncle shouted, rounding on the assembled elders, his composure cracking wider with every heartbeat. "A foreign king has no standing to interfere in Ashdown's succession." "I have every standing," King Draven said, and though he did not raise his voice, it silenced the hall more thoroughly than a shout could have. "To interfere in the trafficking of debt-bonded Omegas across my border, Alpha Ashdown, which is precisely what my Beta's ledgers demonstrate you have been running for 3 years under cover of a marriage registry so clean it might as well have been printed by a guilty conscience." He nodded to Talia, who stepped forward and unrolled the documents across the ceremonial table with the calm precision of a woman who had waited a long time for this exact moment. 11 names, 11 false territories, and an 8-day-old contract binding your own niece to a buyer who does not exist, filed the same week you scheduled her public auction. An elder near the front, an old woman Briar recognized distantly as a friend of her mother's, one of the few who had ever looked at her with something other than pity, rose slowly from her bench. "Is this true, Desmond?" Her voice cracked with something between grief and fury. "Inez's own daughter?" "She has no proof of blood," her uncle spat. But his eyes had gone to the seal in Briar's hands, and Briar watched, with a satisfaction she hadn't known she was capable of. The exact moment he understood there was no version of this room that ended in his favor. "Then let's find out," Briar said, and stepped forward to the ceremonial verification bowl at the center of the table, The one every Ashdown elder present had watched used 100 times over their lives. The one that could not be forged, bought, or argued with. A single drop of blood, drawn with the ceremonial pin every pack kept for exactly this purpose, met the wax of her mother's seal in the bowl's silver basin. The seal glowed gold. It was not showmanship, Talia had explained to her the week before. Merely old pack magic, blood recognizing blood. No more mysterious than any other law of nature, and no less absolute. But watching 300 witnesses gasp at the sight of it, watching the color drain entirely from her uncle's face, Briar understood for the first time in her life what it meant to be believed. Inez Ashdown's daughter, the old elder said, into the ringing silence, confirmed by seal and blood, before this assembly. She turned, slow and deliberate, to face Briar's uncle. Which means, Desmond, that every tribute count you have read into this ledger for 11 years was read under an illegitimate claim, and that the succession challenge standing before us now is not merely valid. Her gaze swept the hall. It is overdue. Her uncle broke. It happened fast and ugly. A lunge, not for Briar, but for the seal itself, as though destroying the evidence in front of 300 witnesses might somehow undo what they'd already seen. King Draven moved before Briar's own body had finished registering the threat, closing the distance between them in 2 strides and putting himself between her and her uncle's grasping hands with the simple, absolute finality of a much larger predator deciding a conversation was over. "I would reconsider," King Draven said very quietly, and something in his voice made even the guards along the wall go still. "You have exactly 1 dignity left available to you, Alpha Ashdown, and it is walking out of this hall on your own feet rather than being carried." Her uncle looked for one long moment at the seal, at the ledgers, at the ring of elders whose faces had gone from shock to something colder and more final, and then at Briar herself, standing where he had spent 11 years insisting she would never stand. And something in him finally understood there was no argument left to make. "You think a foreign king and a gold-lit seal absolve you of what you tried to do to me?" Briar said, before the guards could lead her uncle from the hall, her voice carrying to every corner of the silence he'd left behind him. 11 years, and you never once let yourself wonder whether I might survive being believed. You built my whole life around the assumption that I never would." Her uncle did not answer. He had, she realized, nothing left to say that wouldn't further condemn him, and for the first time in 11 years, the silence between them belonged entirely to her. "The 11 names in that ledger," she continued, quieter now but no less steady, "will have their own tribunals, their own chance to stand where I'm standing. That's not mercy, Uncle. That's simply what happens when the truth is finally allowed into a room you spent a decade keeping it out of." She turned to the assembled elders, before he could recover enough to protest further. "I would ask this assembly to see that every one of those 11 cases is heard in full, with the same seal and blood standard applied to my own claim tonight. Not because the law requires it of a new Alpha's first act, but because I intend for it to be true of everything this pack does from now on." The old elder who had spoken earlier inclined her head, something like pride breaking through the grief on her weathered face. "Inez's daughter indeed," she murmured, and the words moved through the hall like the closing of a long-held breath. The formal stripping of his title took less time than the harvest tribute reading had. Pack law was old and, in this one respect, mercifully efficient. An Alpha proven to have obtained his title through concealment of a superior blood claim forfeited it immediately upon verification, with no appeal available once the elders present had witnessed the seal test themselves. Her uncle was escorted out under Thornevale guard. Not to a dungeon, Briar noted with some surprise, but to formal custody pending a full accounting of 11 trafficked Omegas, a fate that would occupy considerably more of the rest of his life than any quick punishment could have. You could have let them be harsher with him, Briar said quietly, once the hall had begun to empty and the enormity of the last hour had started slowly to catch up with her legs. I could have, King Draven agreed. But a man who disappears into a dungeon becomes a martyr to anyone still loyal to him, and a mystery to everyone else. A man who stands trial, publicly, for 11 specific and provable crimes against 11 specific women becomes exactly what he is. No more, no less. He looked at her, something gentler than politics in his expression, now that the hall had thinned enough to allow for it. I find the truth, spoken plainly and in public, does considerably more lasting damage to men like your uncle than any dungeon could. The elders, in the confused hours that followed, turned to Briar with the particular desperation of a pack suddenly leaderless and looking for anyone with a legitimate claim to steady it. She would, she realized with something like vertigo, need to decide, soon and largely alone, what kind of alpha she intended to be, assuming she chose to take the title her blood now entitled her to at all. She found King Draven that evening on the same longhouse balcony, where, 11 years and 1 lifetime ago, her mother used to stand watching the harvest fires. He didn't turn when she approached, though she suspected he'd heard her before she'd cleared the doorway. You don't have to decide anything about the title tonight, he said, or about anything else. I know. Briar came to stand beside him, the night air cool against a day that had asked more of her than the previous 11 years combined. But I think I want to. Decide, I mean. Not because anyone's telling me to anymore. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't quite let herself since the carriage, since the hook in her chest had first pulled taut and frightened her more than her uncle ever had. I ran from an auction 2 weeks ago because I thought the only choice left to me was which cage I ended up in. You're the first person who's ever let a choice actually be a choice. That, King Draven said, turning to face her fully, is the only kind of claim I've ever wanted to make on anyone. The kind you're free to refuse. And if I don't refuse it? Something in his pale eyes finally, fully unguarded, answered before his voice did. Then I imagine Thornevale and Ashdown are about to have considerably friendlier trade negotiations than iron ore tariffs ever managed on their own. Briar laughed, a real laugh, unpracticed and slightly startled by its own existence, the first one she could remember in longer than she wanted to admit. When she finally closed the distance between them, it was not because a scent bond had chosen for her, and not because any law or ledger demanded it. It was because, for the first time in her life, the choice was entirely, uncomplicatedly hers, and she found she wanted to make it. Lady Ottilie found them there an hour later, and rather than the awkwardness Briar half expected, the woman simply grinned, entirely unbothered, and produced a folded document from inside her cloak. The Grain Corridor Agreement, she said, dropping it onto the balcony railing between them. I had my scribe draft it 3 days ago, when it became rather obvious how this was going to end. Sign it whenever the two of you finish being insufferable, and do try to have the pack's first formal trade council within the season. I have investors to reassure, and the Alpha King fell in love with a fugitive Omega mid-diplomatic incident is not, strictly speaking, the kind of headline that steadies markets. You could have led with congratulations, King Draven said, dry. I could have, Ottilie agreed, already turning to leave, but I find congratulations land better once the paperwork's signed. Ask any trade house. At the doorway, she paused, glancing back at Briar with something warmer than her earlier briskness had let show. For what it's worth, Alpha Ashdown. I meant what I said in that rest house. I'm glad someone finally proved the ledgers were lying. Rule well. The pack deserves it, after 11 years of being told it didn't. In the weeks that followed, the work of rebuilding a pack proved far less romantic than the Tribunal Hall's dramatic reversal had promised, and Briar found she didn't mind that at all. There were 11 trafficked Omegas to locate and restore, ledgers to unwind stitch by fraudulent stitch, elders to convince that a new alpha's mercy was not the same as her weakness. She spent long days in the same study where her uncle had once hidden a stolen seal behind an accord tapestry, and found, somewhere in the tedious, necessary work of governing, a version of belonging she had never once let herself imagine wanting. The first of the 11 was found within a fortnight. A young Omega named Sable, married on paper to a buyer who had, in truth, never existed, living under a false name in a border town 2 days' ride from the Longhouse. Talia's Thornevale contacts located her working in a weaver's shop, unaware her husband had been a fiction from the start, unaware anyone was even looking. Briar rode out herself to bring her home rather than send a steward, because she remembered too well what it felt like to be a name in someone else's ledger, rather than a person anyone came looking for. "I didn't think anyone would notice I was gone," Sable told her, on the ride back, voice still thin with disbelief. "My own pack elders signed the marriage contract. Nobody asked where the groom actually lived. They're asking now," Briar said. "Every one of them. And they will keep asking, for every name on that list, until there's no name left unaccounted for." It was, she realized as she said it, less a promise to Sable than a promise to the 11-year-old girl she'd once been. Standing outside a mourning hall no one had bothered to explain to her either. Not every reunion came easily. 2 of the 11 had been sold across the eastern border entirely, into territories with no formal treaty with Thornevale, and recovering them meant King Draven personally opening negotiations he had no diplomatic obligation to pursue, purely because Briar had asked him to. "This isn't Ashdown's debt to collect," she told him, half guilty at the scale of the favor. "It's mine. You don't have to spend Thornvale's leverage on it." "Thornvale's leverage exists precisely for problems that matter," he said. "And I have never in my reign found one that mattered more than 11 women who were sold as though they were livestock rather than people. You will stop apologizing for asking me for things, Briar. It is, I promise you, not a burden. It is the first request for help I've had in years that I've actually wanted to say yes to." King Draven returned to Thornevale within the month. A king's duties did not pause for a fate bond, however inconvenient that truth proved to be. But the road between their territories, Briar noted with private satisfaction, saw considerably more traffic in the seasons that followed than iron ore tariffs alone could account for. Some choices, she was learning, did not need to be made all at once, in a single tribunal hall or a single moving carriage. Some could simply be renewed, deliberately, again and again, for as long as both people kept choosing them. Below the balcony, the harvest fires burned on into the night, the same fires her mother had once watched, the same pack finally, after 11 long years, standing in the light of a truth no one could bury again. She had run from an auction believing herself worth nothing but a debt to be settled. She had climbed into a stranger's carriage expecting only to escape one cage. She had not expected, in the end, to find the one thing no one had ever offered her before. Not a rescue, not a rule, but a choice, freely given, freely made, entirely her own. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the harvest fires had burned down to embers, Briar found herself standing at that same balcony railing, remembering the girl who had once believed a torn dress and a dark carriage were the worst that could happen to her in a single night. That girl had run because she thought every door in her life led to a different kind of cage. She had not known yet that some doors, opened by the right hands at the right moment, simply kept opening, into a pack finally worth ruling honestly, into 11 names restored to lives that were truly their own, into a fate bond that had asked for nothing but the freedom to be chosen rather than claimed. She had run from an Alpha King's territory believing herself unmateable, unwanted, and worth nothing more than the debt attached to her name. She left that Tribunal Hall, an alpha in her own right, loved by a king who had never once tried to make that love a condition of anything, and she understood, finally, that the two truths were not contradictions at all. They were simply the beginning and the end of the same long night, the night she stopped waiting to be rescued and started, instead, choosing herself. The Alpha King's carriage, it turned out, had never been the trap she'd feared. It had simply been the first door in her life that opened outward.